these pieces. Besides the fact that they're history to me, I just think they're beautiful. And for a long time, I thought they were too beautiful. Beauty is a problem sometimes in art making. In the 70s, the rest of the world thought that beauty was a weakness, but the reality is it's a strength. And I think just as other things have changed in the world, things come around, you know.
So exciting. I'm dying to see this.
There you go.
That is beautiful. Oh my gosh, Barbara, this is exciting. I love it. Yes. Yeah.
I'm gonna work with this again, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah, I like it.
Oh, I do too.
This was my first attempt at photography. It's called cyanotype. It's a liquid emulsion that's a mix of iron and bleach. Any object can be placed on it and exposed in sunlight. When it's washed, it turns blue. And blue is such a spiritual color. I love the fact that this blue can be so intense. In the 70s, when I was teaching textile sculpture, I needed a way to demonstrate how to take a flat woven surface and make a three-dimensional form. And I found this window screening. When I saw how 2 layers make a beautiful moire, I thought of this cyanotype process and experimented with that. It's very easy. It didn't require a dark room. And I liked the idea that it was more like a printmaking process, but it happened to be a photographic recording. I just knew that there was something special about these works. And I just put them away for a while. I didn't want them out in the world without some sort of recognition as a body of work. I still have an affinity for materials. I still respond to the transparencies and textures of different surfaces. At that point in time, I really had a freedom. I didn't know anything about photography. Now I think I know too much about photography. It was a more experimental time in a different way.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Stephanie Cristello. I'm the artistic director of Expo Chicago, and I'm so happy to have Barbara Kasten here. And what we just watched was a short film that Barbara did with our partners Art21 in, what year was it, Barbara? 2016, in advance of your Graham Foundation exhibition, right?
Right.
Yeah. But thank you for being here. You know, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, and sort of a really great moment for us to be connecting, because this discussion is going to be taking place in advance of some research that we're doing on architecture and blueness. So it's sort of the perfect moment. But before we just start the conversation, I wanted to thank the sponsor that made this possible, Rebecca Wone from Chartwell Insurance Services. Thank you so much for supporting this conversation. I think it's going to be a really historic talk, and what Barbara Kasten and I are going to be speaking about is essentially work that has never been, a lot of it has never been shown in public. And a lot of the work, really speaks to some of the through lines of Barbara's practice that have not been discussed as much in scholarship. And so this is really, a wonderful moment for us to be speaking about this today during exhibition weekend with Expo Chicago. So I wanted to thank you, Barbara, for offering to do this. So basically, I've got a lot of slides that we're going to be sharing of works from the 70s up until, I think the last one was made just a week ago. But before we sort of do that, I wanted to set up the conversation and essentially give everyone a sense of what we're talking about here. So you and I started talking about blue in my backyard maybe a month ago, when we were just doing our first social distanced meetup in advance of the book that's being published with Skira in 2021, that just got announced that it received a Graham Foundation publication grant. So we're really getting started on everything now. But I mentioned that I was curating a show about blue based on Maggie Nelson's book, Blueness, which is a treatise on the color. And I just saw your eyes light up, and we talked for hours about this color, but also how it's woven its way through your practice over the decades, and has really helped to essentially, for me, create a blueprint of your work. And some of the architectural and archaeological facets of your work. So I wondered if you wanted to give, maybe a few words on blue and the phases of the work that we'll be talking about today. We've got things from the 70s through the present, but we've got a lot of images that we're going to be sharing with everyone. Maybe you can just give a little bit of a background for you on blue.
Well, blue, in most of my work, comes from a process called cyanotype. And most of them are photograms. That's not everything, but it's the majority of what we'll see. But it's not just about the technique, it's about what this technique can do.
Right.
And the technique can transform reality, because we know that photography has, its basis in reality. But this process is a blue one. And so when it's used, it changes our emotional connection to the work. The early works, which were featured in that film, are really gray, very normal, ugly window screening. And if I photographed them or, just used them in a black and white process, it wouldn't have the same reaction from people. When it turns blue, it creates an emotional response that we can't really sometimes define why. And so it has this, ability to abstract, and its ability to change our perception of reality, really, in the end.
Yeah, and I loved in the Art21 film that we just showed, you also said spiritual connection, that blue has a spiritual connection for you. And, I don't think it's, it's not a unique feeling. Blue is sort of this color that embodies, more than any color on the spectrum, all of these poetic, emotional, spiritual potentials that, have been traced through history. And I don't want to focus too much on the book, but just to show everyone, this is the book by Maggie Nelson. It's Blueness. And, there's certain lines in here that I'm sure I'm going to recall and remember as we go through our talk. But the first line of the book is, suppose I were to begin by saying that I had fallen in love with a color. And I feel like what you've done with this tracing of blue, at least what I see, looking at all of these works spanning almost 4 decades, is a true love story with a color.
Well, it is, and it's something that I sort of revert to every time I have an important event in my life or an important emotion that I need to portray. Many of these works were done spontaneously in a way, just out of a need to work, like this last body of work you're going to show is
Right.
like, you know, we're under pressure with COVID and I just needed to do something. And so
Yeah.
the first thing that comes to mind is creating something hands-on, and it produces blue. So it's always in my mind, every work that I've done has always been connected to some sense of emotional need, I guess, in a way. But
And you're
it's not,
talking from your home studio right now.
right now, I've transformed, I'm lucky to have a 2-flat, and I transformed one of them into a home studio. And it's really been great. And I have to say, I never really, liked the idea of living in a normal house. I'm a real urban being with need to be in high rises and all of that. But this has certainly been great because I have a backyard, which enabled me to do these cyanotypes.
Yeah.
And now I can do a little work besides the work I've been doing over the internet.
Yeah. And when we spoke just a few days ago, you called the color blue your homeland. And so I think one of the most interesting things of the works that we're going to show also is that they're photographed everywhere. Like, you've been able to make these works in a lot of different places, from Turkey to Britain to Spain to your backyard. It's sort of this through line that follows you no matter where you travel. And there is this sense of home that you feel when you look at the works too.
And home is always where you are, right? It's never just a location. It's
Well,
really,
it might be for you, home is where you are able to make images.
that's probably the case.
You
Yeah.
can't stop.
No.
So I wanted to sort of kick off the presentation aspect of this and show everybody some work. But what we can do is, we don't have to talk about any specific work too much, but maybe focus on the period of work, how it fits into you as your like in your chronology and your timeline of practice. And the first thing that we're going to start with is the diazotypes. When we first looked at the cyanotypes together, those were made in 1974, some of the first ones, but we discovered that also there were these blue diazotypes that came beforehand in the 60s. So we're going to start with that, and I'm going to share my screen here. So just give me 1 second.
I hate to correct that, but it really wasn't the 60s. I looked it up, and because sometimes I forget when I've done things, and
My notes could be totally wrong also.
so I may have said 60s to you at one point, but it was really in the 70s when I returned from Poland, where I had been on a Fulbright. And at that time I was doing fiber sculpture and had made these seated chair forms, which were shown in the film. But to go along with it, I wanted to produce some, surreal, I guess, in a way, images and probably a feminist sort of point of view of our human connection to a chair. But I was inspired by the architectural process of diazotype because it had an immediacy, and it also produced this surreal blue, which took it again out of reality to another place.
Did anything freeze for anybody else?
So I didn't. I think either you're frozen on my screen or I can't hear you.
Yeah, I think Stephanie is frozen. Stephanie, if you can hear us, just turn your video off. And perhaps she'll rejoin us here in a minute if she drops off the meeting. Yeah, I think she's going to rejoin us. So we'll just stand by and wait for her.
Technology, it's great and it's frustrating, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Did I get kicked off? I think I'm back. I'm so sorry. All right, let me share my screen again. So Barbara, I'm not sure what you covered in that minute that I was in the ether, but maybe you could talk about the vernacular of the diazotype just for people that aren't familiar with it. It's an architectural standard for the process, right?
Right. Yes, that's the point I was making, is that I was inspired by architecture in a lot of ways because I found it had a technique that could produce ephemeral images. Actually, these were not meant to last, even though the photographs are still on film. You know, the images themselves have been protected now. I have them because I've never shown them. And then we produced a book. The Graham Foundation produced a wonderful documentation of the whole series that I did.
Yeah, and that book was amazing. And you know, it's no longer in print either. So access to these images is really rare, but I think essential for everyone that you know, wants to learn truly about your practice. You know, because we talk so much about the constructivist elements of your work and your relationship with photography, but the underpinning of architectural practice is almost equally, if not more, of an important through line for a lot of the work that we're talking about today.
And its connection to the human form, actually,
Yeah.
when you think about it too, because it was the very beginnings of my experimentation. But I reduced the human form to abstraction as well. So, you know, abstraction's always been a very important element in my work, whether it's in the actual photographs I make in the studio or in these photograms. Mahoney said the photogram was the closest connection to abstraction. And I really buy that. I think it's true. It has this ability to take something that we think we know, and yet we can see it in a different way. And that's also why I think of abstraction as a political tool, because it can, in essence, make us look at something outside of ourselves. And people don't usually give it credit for that. It's not always that you have to, you know, have an image of what life is about. It can also work with your mind and how you see life.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important. And we've talked about the photogram for you being the most essential part of your practice too. It's really where the seed of constructivism from Mahoney comes into play, but it's through this blue lens that all happens.
Right, exactly.
So these are some of the first ones that you ever did.
Yes.
My understanding, is that correct?
Right, these are 1974, 75, and then in 1976, I started adding inks, you know, because I came to this whole thing as a painter, so it wasn't so much about breaking the norms of photography. It was really more to me about how I could incorporate this into painting, you know, because my mind was in painting, not in the darkroom. So this idea of adding color had to come in the process, which I think you have a couple of slides of that.
You know, I didn't put in the ones with the drawings on top.
Oh, but there were some in 1976 that have inks added to it after these. These are the first ones.
These are the window screenings.
Yeah, and this came in 1990 actually, or even later, no, 90. And it's a ruin. I was into a lot of prehistoric architectural imagery and sites, and this was something that I did in New Mexico at the
Yeah, and the reason why I put this one here is because New Mexico needs to come first when we're talking with you. I mean, it's such an important site and place. I believe even your earrings right now are from New Mexico.
These are my standby earrings and my standby ring. Can you see me? Because I don't see a screen of myself. Is that?
I can see you. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, now I can. All right.
Yeah. No, but you carry you carry New Mexico literally with you almost every day and every time I've seen you. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about, what is so special about that place, especially when we're talking about the spiritual connection with blue. I know that you have a really unique relationship to New Mexico as a site.
It's the general Southwest, I guess, too. It's not so much just New Mexico, although that's the primary place. I did go to school at the university in Arizona, but that was after I moved from Chicago with my parents to Arizona. When I was finished doing the architectural sites that some people know about, with, postmodernism and buildings mostly in cities, they were museums and financial institutions. I kind of had to regroup, and I thought about what I just learned in doing that. And I decided that I had to go back to my roots, which was going back to New Mexico and the Southwest. And so that's why these images in the Southwest came about.
Oh, yeah. No, so this is the one. So this is the ruins. And are they're footprints, if I'm reading the image correctly, but they could be anything.
Yeah, they could.
What are those?
Well, those are the ruins of an archaeological site on the top of a mesa in Santa Clara, New Mexico, which is right outside of Santa Fe. So, yes, if you've never seen this, in a real quote unquote image showing reality, it's hard to read because it does transform it into abstraction.
Yeah.
But it's basically an overview of a footprint of a village that was once existent for the Santa Clara.
Yeah, and that's when we really get into this archaeological thread that it sort of weaves in and out of the work, sometimes passing into abstraction, sometimes in more obvious ways. And when we're talking about the Amphora works that you did and, more recognizable images of ruins, we'll certainly get there. But I think going back to the comments on the diazotypes, it's this idea of our relationship to human form. Life, but it could also be like forms of life, forms of anything that relates to either a human life or evidence of life.
Exactly, and the great history of architecture that we have in our own country goes back to these ruins of the Native Americans sites, and many of the things I did in Europe have a deeper, longer history because things have been in existence there, or at least knowledge of them for a much longer time. But this is really our basic, prehistoric kind of sighting, even though they weren't prehistoric.
Right. No, it's like very much part of our history, but not a visible history that's told so often.
Right. Exactly.
So I wanted to go into a few more. I believe all of these were taken in Britain.
No, these are a mix. The two, the one at the top and the one in the middle, which unfortunately I sent to you in that position, but it's really a horizontal.
Do I have them wrong? All right.
No, it was my fault because I didn't send it to you the correct way. But those two were sites that I found in Brittany, and the one in the lower right. And they were really I thought the one on the left is a dolmen, and the history of how these huge boulders were moved and placed in a position very similar to Stonehenge.
Yeah.
And but they are all over the world in many different places. And the interesting part to me was that they always have some reference to goddesses. And many of them I found sort of chiseled necklaces and things that referenced a woman's presence. So I found that to be totally intriguing. That the history is based in the feminist position.
Yeah.
And I actually think of them as gynecological architecture, because there's a long passageway one has to get to the interior, which opens up into a much larger space, and it really resembles the shape of a womb. And they think of that they probably were burial sites. So it has that kind of history to it, which was as much intriguing to me as the color. But what was I going to say about that? The others are the one on the lower left and the upper right are both from Tarragona, Spain, and they're from Tarragona is the site of the most ancient ruins, Roman ruins in Europe, and so these again were appealing to me because of the history, because of the architecture, and from the fact that all of them were built with stone from one particular quarry in that area. So again, a lengthy history, a connection to architecture, and this blue, which indicated to me this kind of ephemeral past memory in a way, and also referencing the architectural cyanotype or diazoprint in another way. So it all kind of merged together.
So I have so much to say, so I'm going to try and organize my thoughts. So the first is with the relationship to goddesses, because I think in your work, not many would, from at least the constructions and the plexiglass sculptures and the photographs, not many would sort of indicate a feminist undertone with those works. But I think, with not only the location of these sites and the image that they portray, but specifically the color blue is what makes them so so feminine. And I'm sort of reminded, I was reading this Julia Kristeva book, Black Sun, on depression and melancholy, and there's clinical reports that are included in this book, and it's blue is also a color of a word for an emotion, blue to feel melancholy. And it's said in almost all of these reports that women feel the deepest blue. And whether that is a psychological predisposition or a historical, overlay on women's emotions, as noted by men, at the time, especially from these reports, there is this relationship or this common understanding, whether it's true or not, that withstands that women feel like the deepest blue, the deepest depression, the deepest emotions.
Yeah, but that in a way, there's another side to that, that may be true, but it also paints the picture of instability on women.
Exactly.
And that's a little annoying, because women are actually very stable judgment makers and can see a bigger picture than a lot of single-minded professional men. So, there's a good and a bad side to that analysis, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because the work sort of embodies both, but doesn't choose a side. There's so many contradictions in these works and others where, that boulder balancing doesn't seem like it's going to fall.
Yeah, no.
So you're able to sort of capture these very, what could be tenuous images and concretize them. And that's also the process of photography.
Right. And yeah, that's why I love the idea of using cyanotype, because it transforms that image totally, just by the idea that it doesn't, that it changes the reality with the color, right? I mean, you could paint it blue, or you could paint it yellow, or you could paint it green, but somehow there's this connection to blue that we all experience that is much deeper than just a color hue that is beautiful. And beauty is one of the qualities of blue. There is something there that strikes us as a really beautiful image when you're looking at something that without the blue could just be ordinary or not extraordinary in any way. So, yeah, I
think
find
it's
that fascinating.
Yeah, so I think it's so important while we're looking at these historic sites too, to sort of think about what these ruins would have been used for, right? In the agora, or as places for these conversations. And I just, Plato's a very funny character. He's a very eccentric thing to think, but he wanted all color out of the Republic, and would like actually make treatises and fights against the color blue because it was too beautiful and it drew you after it. So he ended up calling color generally, but also blue, like a type of pharmacon, like a drug, that it was something that draws you after it.
It's true, I think, yeah.
All right, so then we get into these folded screen-like works, which I had never seen before, and I don't think many people have.
These are very small, by the way. These are like 3 or 4 inches high. These are not, because they're floating on a black background, you can't get the sense of scale. But these are very small. They're very Japanese in the sense of wanting an object that folds together and is very precious, that one can carry with you if you really wanted to. And in these, it really encapsulates history to a greater degree, because these are fossils. These are actually leftover remnants from prehistoric times. So there's a very spiritual quality to it. It's kind of like what an ikat or ikat texture or coloration would be in the Japanese fabric making too, or any other. There are other cultures that use it as well, but all of that's embedded in the way I was thinking about when I made these pieces.
So they're like little pockets of history, right? Like they're small, they're small things. But I think, it is interesting looking at them on the screen here and never having actually seen these in person. Their architectural scale could also be scaled up to the size of a wall in your mind. This could be a maquette, or it could be at actual size. And I know that there is one piece, I'm not even going to try and remember the year right now, 60s or 70s, of the wall, the cyanotype wall that you did in LA. I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Did I send you an image of that one? I don't think so.
No, but I think it's an important idea. These works make me think of the way that you described that.
Yes, and these probably came about because of that wall, because the wall had to be at least 10, 12 feet high and, I don't know, 20 feet wide. And they were cyanotypes, or they probably were diazotypes. This is where my memory fails me. And I think, how did I do that? Because it wasn't painted. It was exposed in the sunlight and wallpapered onto the wall. But they were diazotypes. And that was in the 60s. That is probably the earliest blue piece. It was a show at Scripps College when I was living in LA in the 60s and 70s. So just the fact that it's the screen, it is not only just this handheld little precious object, it can also be looked upon as, a huge architectural edifice, you know, it's part of a building. It references so many different ways of architecture. And I've used this folded kind of screen-like thing in other ways. I did a video that I showed here in Chicago that actually incorporated, it was 3 videos, and one of the surfaces I built a screen. So it's kind of like, once I get something in my head, it never leaves. It comes back in many different ways. And the blue part of it is so embedded with me that it's just part of who I am and who I am as an artist to use this cyanotype to produce a blue that can't be produced any other way, I don't think.
No, they're special. So these are also some of the fossils.
Right.
And then we get to the amphora. And this is, I loved your story about this. So these were taken when you were in Turkey, in Bodrum, in the 90s.
They were, I was on kind of a residency. It was kind of a, very loose residency, but it gave me the ability to go and have a place to stay in Turkey. And when I arrived, of course, there was no dark room or anything, but not that I needed a dark room because I never used one anyhow, but there was this ancient Byzantine church, which was half in ruins, as was part of this residency location. And there was beautiful sunlight, and it was right on the Aegean. And so I immediately thought, well, what better process than a cyanotype, where I can, take advantage of all these conditions. And so I painted these pieces of paper. These are like 22 by 30. I had brought paper with me and the chemistry because I had thought this as a possibility. And so I painted in the moonlight of this Byzantine church these pieces of paper coated with cyanotype. I carried them up to the Underwater Museum of Archaeology in Bodrum, which was like a half an hour away from this tiny village. And the curators were so enthralled with this idea, they took these amphora off the walls, the exhibition walls, if you can imagine, and laid them on these papers for me, which were, I put into the sunlight of a courtyard. I mean, to have that kind of extraordinary, cooperation and intrigue with the whole situation was unique to begin with. But in case people don't know, I'm sure most of you do, but these amphoras were found in the Aegean and surrounding areas, and they were from ships that went down. They were carrying things like grains and oil and precious commodities. So, again, they lived under the water for centuries until.
And these vessels were what were carrying those goods.
Yes, these actual vessels. So, when you think about all that history and connection to the world, and the world needs on so many different levels, it just becomes an emotional thing for me. And blue helps me realize that. Not only does it kind of like put it back in the ocean where they were found, but it also lifts them up into an ephemeral realm that's not real. It's just, they have so many qualities to them that I get very, it was in a very emotional situation for me to be able to do that.
Yeah, and so many of these, they look almost like X-rays or
yes, right.
Vessels that you would find. I mean, this one, we've talked about it. It looks almost like a bomb. They've transformed from these very beautiful but utilitarian objects into, I love when you say returning them back to the sea. I mean, they really just look like they're floating there.
Right. But we look at artworks from our perspective today. And so, for us to sort of look at that previous image as a bomb is just, where we have come in, like, knowing what a bomb is, which they didn't at the time
Right.
the vessel was made.
Yeah, you have to contend with all of the aesthetic markers that get imported from various times. And these amphora are from about 2 to 4 BC.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why the curators were handling him, not me.
Mhm.
But, had they not been willing to do that, these never would have been made. So,
Did I make this up, or was one of the curators a diver that actually found some of
oh
these?
yeah, oh yeah. No, the curators were actual divers who brought some of these objects up from the ocean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
from the Aegean. And then also they went diving off the coast of Galveston, Texas.
Well, because there was some kind of, I used to know, but I can't remember exactly why. There was a program there that dealt with, underwater research and employed these curators, all trained through it. So
Mhm.
there's some connection there that I can't verify because I can't remember the details. But yeah, no, these were, international um, curators. They were not just, people who went down to the ocean that they could see. Although I have to say, I was in this little town and there were many ruins that were in the water that you could see the tops of. In fact, you could almost walk on water. Um, that just being in an environment like that where history is so much around you, and you can experience it in a different way, was really unique and special.
Well, and I think it taps into all of the underlying mythologies in your work, right? Like when you're even talking about that, it's essentially a description of Atlantis, like an underground,
Right, I felt
a
like that.
sunken city.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm. So we go from those into, I haven't seen these ones actually yet, but there's quite a few of these, and I believe they're fossils.
They're fossils, but they were an experimentation of my uh, you know use of the cyanotype and exposures, and it was like pushing the emulsion like a paint. It really was. And at the time, well, these were in the 90s, but my history of being a painter also came through, because these reference a lot of the stain painters and such, Frankenthal or people like that, who actually moved paint around by pushing and dripping and all these kinds of techniques that I use to make this cyanotype. And that's where you get the many levels of blue and ability to get a sense of space. They're very cosmic feeling to me.
Yeah, I think Claire had written also the photogram paintings, and this really taps into this idea of moving the pigment around in a way that usual like straightforward photographs can't and don't do.
No, but see, that's it. You have to get out of the realm of referencing these as photographs in a way,
Yeah,
because
they're not.
because they're not. No, they're really experiments with paint. And
Yeah,
it's just a paint that happens to be a photographic emulsion.
yeah. No, we've joked about how no one asks painters what size brush they use,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So we're not going to talk about the photographic process. It doesn't matter. I mean, what's more interesting to me is that these images allude to the cosmos, whereas the amphora allude to an underground realm, like an underworld realm or the marine realm. And these are two of the spaces that we humans at this moment know virtually nothing about.
Exactly. It's intriguing to us. We don't know where we came from exactly, and we don't know where we've been exactly. But both of these kind of represent the two directions of this, the depth of our planet and the depth of our universe. So it becomes
They
very
like
spiritual.
expand and go deeper. Yeah, they expand as far as they can and they go as deep as they can in these opposing ways. But
right. But the thing is that this didn't come about because I set about to prove that. They came about because I was working with materials in such a way where I just tried to push it to the point of uniqueness in terms of how they've been observed and used in the past. And so, it didn't come from a philosophical standpoint. That happened after I realized what they did and what they evoked in me and hopefully in others.
I mean, and I'm sure those feelings ended up working their way into the other works that are more familiar, that everyone sees.
I think so. I mean, it goes back to the abstraction as the core of the body of work, of all of my work, really, of taking something that we recognize and turning it in a way and looking at it from another perspective that makes it an unfamiliar object that we need to stop and reconsider. And not take for granted.
Yeah. And so we've got a few more of the ruins here, but I just, these images are phenomenal. I don't know, it's something about the inverse nature of them that gives them this otherworldly but potentially catastrophic undertone to them. They're really foreboding.
Yeah, it's that negative image that happens, right. And even when this, like in a positive, almost positive form, isn't really, it is a negative, and it brings you again away from your reality. If you looked at that in real life, you certainly wouldn't get the experience of the same as looking at this interpretation of reality, really.
Right. I mean, for me, this is about as architectural as the early screen, the folded window screens.
Right.
If you blur your eyes, there's hardly any, it really flattens the images or dramatizes them in ways that are special. So I want to talk about the new works that you're making in your backyard right now. That's kind of where we're leading, which is something a little more familiar, Barbara, but this is the history that has led to these images.
Right. And these, I have to emphasize is these may not be complete images because I tend to like to draw and make markings on paper as well. So these may not stay this pure blue, but they may. I don't know yet.
Very much in process right now. Like we can't quite tell.
Right. It just feels good to be able to do something physical instead of something that has to go through electronic transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And I am making new works, over the internet with designing and orchestrating installations. That I have a show at the Aspen Art Museum, and we've been, I created 2 new works, 3 actually, for that show. And it all had to happen during COVID over the Zoom meetings. But yeah.
So I just want to show everybody how you've been making these. Like, that's a very different image, right? we talk about it all the time that blue really transforms things, but I think it's amazing how the light comes through these different colors and has what is it here? It's like there was a spot that didn't get fully brushed on, but in the image it ends up looking like the reflection of a sea, like moon
Yeah,
over the sea.
yeah,
There's so
but
many of these poetic potentials to the work that come from these very concrete materials and approaches.
well, it's the, it's the process that's important anyway in the end, because it also reveals lots of things about itself, as this does. And it, in some cases, can add to the imagery, even like the bleeding along the edges, add a dimension as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll have to get another picture of you. I looked everywhere, but I don't have one with blue, but I feel like this is the work.
Ah, I love this. This is the one you took of me at the Crown Hall. I just always love this image.
Yeah, me too. For some reason in my mind, I remembered it as blue.
Yeah, well,
And I found it, and it's in fact the opposite. But I'll stop sharing here so that we can have some closing thoughts. I didn't make it clear, but if anybody had any questions in the Q&A, now would be a time to type it. But since we're not doing this in person, questions aren't always a thing that happens. So, Barbara, I wanted to thank you for sort of taking us through these unknown territories of your work.
well, thank you for seeing that, this kind of unique perspective on blue, and allowing me to participate in a way about work that I haven't been able to put out into the world too often, except for the very early cyanotypes, which have only been in a few museum shows. So I appreciate your interest in
Yeah, well, this will be the first of many conversations that we'll have in advance of the book, which is going to focus on architecture and film. But it sort of felt like not a serendipitous discovery, but something that we knew that it was there in the work. These undertones that are not just cold and formal and distanced. There are these like very intimate moments in your work, and I feel like it's impossible to have a conversation about your larger pieces without knowing this context of what is truly part of an integral part of your practice.
Right, exactly. It's not just the structures that I've built in the last 5 years, but the history of how they came about and how they're still related to the very beginnings in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a real blueprint.
Thank you for inviting me to do this. It's been really fun, and I'm sorry I can't see everybody else, but it was great just discussing all of this with you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and so for everyone that's here now and watching streaming online at program.expochicago.com, that's where we'll have the recording of this following the conversation. But also, so Barbara, you did an interview with Ocula that I thought was really great on the Wolfsburg Museum show, which is your latest solo exhibition in Germany. And so we've partnered with Ocula to make that article available and the conversation available to everyone attending here. And thank you, Rebecca from Chartwell Insurance, who's presenting this talk and allowing us to actually host these conversations with all the artists in Chicago. So we're incredibly thankful for that. And then I just also want to make sure that we acknowledge all of our presenting sponsors for exhibition weekend. For Expo, I'll say this was a very large pivot for us to typically right now we'd all be gathered together at Navy Pier, and we're not, we're from our own homes. And to be able to shine such a spotlight on Chicago artists and Chicago galleries, it's really filling the void for this weekend. So thanks to all of the presenting sponsors for exhibition weekend, which is Northern Trust, Terry Dowd, Liberty, as well as Chartwell and our media partners, Artsy, Art in America, Ocula, and The Scene. So we'll figure out what comes next in terms of writing Barbara, but for everybody here, if this will be a huge portion of the book that comes out next year. So we hope that everyone will keep their eyes out for it.
And meanwhile, if you can get your hands on the Ocula interview, I have to say it's probably, I feel, the best about that I've done in a long time, because I had a great rapport with Stephanie Bailey, and would just seem to be able to cover a lot of territory that I am not always able to express. So I thank them for running that article.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Barbara. This is all thanks to you, really. So we'll let everybody, well, I guess we'll sign off by saying goodbye.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.